So the next presenter will be Dr. Shelly Kreitzer Levy from the Academic College of Law and Business in Ramat Gan. And she will discuss reimagining intimacy through property relation. Shelly.
Okay. So good morning, everyone, and can you hear me? Is that okay? Yeah. More? Okay. Okay. So good morning, and thank you, Shai, for inviting me and for hosting this really wonderful conference. Now, my presentation here today is about the intersection of... Okay. I'll speak up. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the intersection of property and intimacy, right? So it's a working project trying to think about how these two concepts work together. Now, when I say intimacy, I mean meaningful, close-knit, long-term relationships that are not confined to the idea of a family. And so I think this intersection is especially fruitful and interesting because we do think of property as hosting or providing a space for these type of meaningful relationships in the neighborhood, in the home, in the workplace. So one could study this intersection from two different directions. So one direction, I think the most familiar one and the one that most popular with family scholars, is let's start with the relationship. We'll start with a relationship and then we'll discuss the property implication of that particular relationship. So let's take a couple of examples. First example, a married couple, right? We have a married couple. That's a very clearly legally defined relationship. And then we may have property implications of that relationships when the couple gets a divorce or at death. Or to take another example, we have the parent-child relationship, and then we need to consider what happens to the parent's property after death, right? In case, bless you, in case the parent did not leave a valid will. And again, we have the parent-child relationship, and we might have property implications. Now, in both of these examples, the relationship is very clearly legally defined, and we understand that given certain preferences and vulnerabilities, we might have property implications. But the property is almost a byproduct of this analysis. It's not the focus. Now, from a family law perspective, or family scholars, right, the problem is that the law defines a family in a much too narrow way, right? So there are various attempts by family law scholars to sort of stretch the definition. So it's not just a married couple, we're also talking about cohabitants. It's not just a biological relationship, it's also functional parenthood. But I think, again, and some people, I'm sorry, talk about siblings, they talk about friendships, but I think that the main challenge for family law today remains, right, that it's really difficult to define, how do we define a family in a way that truly allows for freedom of association and a plurality of voices, but is still able to distinguish between thick commitments and more casual ties. Right. And so I want to approach this intersection from a different direction, and that's from the property direction. So instead of beginning with the relationship and then moving to the property, let's start with the property and look at the ways that people use and share property, and then look at different levels of commitment that these types of uses and sharing create regardless of any legal or social relationship. So this frees us only partly, of course, but from some of the family law conundrums. And let me give you a couple of examples as well. So the first example is a very famous example, the Burden sisters. Some of you probably have heard of it. It's a famous case from about a decade ago from the UK, where you had two single elderly British sisters. And they lived together their entire life. And for the last 30 years, they co-owned the home. And they wanted to get the same estate tax exemption that married couple and civil partners get in the UK. And they were denied. So they got all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights, and they were denied. They were denied because they're sisters, and sisters are not the same kind of relationship as a married couple. Now, my second example is a less known case. It's from Florida. It's the Frambach v. Donahue case. You had a widower with 7 children and a married couple with 4 children. And they decided to live together. And they lived together for 19 years. They shared a home, they renovated their home, they shared expenses. And then one day after 19 years, the couple said to the widower, leave our home, right, immediately. And then the widower asked for an equitable lien, and he wanted a third of the home, and was denied, of course. Now, both of these cases don't fit with the start with a relationship approach, right? So we don't know how to define these relationships, and courts are really reluctant to sort of stretch the definition of a family. So these challenges, Mr. Donahue and the Burden sisters, are ultimately fail, right? Instead, what we can do is we can think about the ways that they share the property, different types of use that constitute different levels of commitment. So I've used this approach in two of my previous projects, the home and inheritance, and let me say something briefly about both of them. So in the context of the home, right, we can think about different levels of commitment in sharing a home. So people can live together very casually. People can live together and share a home for long periods of time. And people can share a home and share resources, so commingle their funds. And each type of living together will have different property implications, right? So we don't have to focus on the relationship. Are there siblings? Are there unrelated adults? Or at the other end of the spectrum, a married couple? Okay. We focus on different level of sharing property. So sharing the home and commingling funds may be... Okay, I'll continue. Okay, so may result, right? We need to figure it out, but may result in co-ownership or tax exemption. So another example is inheritance, right? So very roughly speaking, the law has two main options, right? A person can leave a valid will and then distribute his or her property to their loved ones, their chosen beneficiaries, or if they don't, the law provides a set of default rules based on familial affinity. Shall I continue? Okay. And some countries limit testamentary freedom in favor of protected heirs, right? Mostly children. So protection against this inheritance is based on, again, a set of predefined relationship, parents and children. And instead what we can do is think about the meaning of post-mortem transfers of property. We can think about the meaning of property and death. And rather than looking at biological or legal affinity, we should think about what kind of commitments are the basis for continuity through property. So the idea behind this approach is not only that we potentially relax the definition of a family, but also it has three other potential implications. So one of them is that we open up our options and think about practices and uses rather than relationships that are harder to pin down. The other is that we focus on a particular issue, the home or inheritance, and we are not committed to a broad overreaching definition. And the third one is that we understand property as a sort of platform for multiple interactions and activities. But there are, of course, important drawbacks to this approach. So let me talk a little bit about that. So first of all, there are reasons to clearly define the relationship. Some relationships are inherently unequal, so they have power imbalances and vulnerabilities. And so if we want to protect these vulnerabilities, we have to discuss the relationship itself. So instead of replacing one approach with the other, we should think about how and when we want to implement each of them. And then to that point, we have to also realize that this type of exploration is not entirely different from the relationship-centered approach. So we will most likely have some shared considerations and principles. But importantly, the focus is different. So we start with the property and then we work with property uses. Another drawback of this approach, but it's also a drawback of the relationship-centered approach, is that it has a tendency towards homogeneous communities. So this approach favors long-term, stable relationships that are, for the most part, relationships with people who are like us, right? Similar to us. This is one of the inherent problems in protecting communities more generally. So strong communities tend to be homogeneous and typically employ, as we just heard, exclusive practices, whether these are intended or not. So I started with the home, and let me circle back to the home. So we started by arguing that sharing the home, like the Frambachs and Donahues and like the Burden sisters, at different levels of use may create different levels of commitment. So the argument builds on the understanding that the home serves as a sort of relational and communal spatiality. So people who live together share their lives, they share private information, and sometimes commingle their resources, and this is the meaning of intimacy. And then, so the rise of the platform economy now deconstructs this concept and allows us to reflect on this position of the home. So Airbnb, for example, has changed the meaning of living with others. So I'm now talking specifically about people who rent out a room in their home, not people renting out entire houses. So what happens is that Airbnb not only invites commercial activities into the home, as has always been the case, but it also destabilizes relationships in it, right? So the home becomes a site for fleeting temporal interactions with tourists that come and go, right? And when people share a home, even with tourists, they will be exposed to private information. There is this certain kind of intimacy that is very difficult to escape. So living together becomes casual, flexible, and this type of cohabitation coexists with the long-term, stable, meaningful relationships. And so the rise of the platform economy allows us to see that property can potentially support these stable, intimate relationships and the flexible, casual relationship with strangers, even in spaces that we understand to be very personal, very intimate locations. So we have to be careful when we focus on property as the basis for defining FIC commitments. It's not a property per se, whether it is the home or otherwise. We need to return to property use and to be open to different types of engagements. Thank you.